Because I'm a self-taught artist, I didn't realize that my drawing method was not the usual method that was taught, because as I learnt to draw, I never watched any teaching videos on how to draw. It was only when I began to make videos myself on how to draw, based on my experience, and began to get comments asking why wasn't I teaching the same method that everyone else seemed to teach, that I realized there was a difference in my method. In my mind, I just worked out how to produce the sorts of drawings I was wanting to produce. And I found that it worked well for a wide variety of subjects, not just architectural ones, but also more natural ones, or more scenic ones. It didn't matter whether it was a nautical one, it didn't matter what angle we were looking at it from, and the methods seemed to work well, even for natural subjects, as well as architectural ones. But I think the key thing about my drawing method is that I worked it out as a way of drawing scenes such as these, all drawn directly, freehand, in ink. Because that's the style of drawing I wanted to be able to do, so that I could sketch in ink on location and add colour to it if I wanted. So what is the more commonly taught method I'm referring to here, and why don't I use it? Why do I draw the way I do? And in a nutshell, what is my drawing method? Let's start with the drawing method that I've come to understand is probably the most common way of drawing. And I think this is a good subject to demonstrate the difference. And it goes something like this. We start with the larger shapes. We see the large shapes that compose our object. And we focus on this large shape, which in this case of this arch in London, Marble Arch, is this rectangle here. So we work at drawing, getting a sense of that shape. And we work out our proportions, and then perhaps we look at some of our smaller proportions. We might now draw this across here to get a sense of what we're looking at. And then we might look at these three shapes here, noticing that this center box is larger than the other one. So we look at that and go, no, well, it's not quite like that. That's probably more accurate. And then we work out perhaps where this line goes. We'll start in the center, but it's not, is it in the center? No, it's a little bit higher than the center. And then we put the arches in. And then we might work out where some of the details go. We might be looking at this line here. Might be thinking of that line here. We've got a column here, but you know, when we put the columns in, it does change the proportions a bit. So we might have to push it out further. Yes, that's looking better. Get a line here for along here. So that's looking a bit better. So now when I draw, I'm able to go, okay, well, I know that we've got columns here, and I can sketch quite confidently and relatively quickly now, because I've started with the larger form and I've broken it down into its smaller components. And I draw my arch. But the reason I never even tried to draw with this method was because I was wanting to draw freehand directly in ink. I didn't want to be lumbered with an eraser, erasing lines all over the place. And that was partly because I have a tendency towards perfectionism, and I was wanting to develop a looser, more gestural style. So I wanted to learn to commit to confident but accurate lines directly with the pen on the paper. And the problem with this is that if I start blocking in the overall form, starting with the larger shape and then refining it down to the smaller elements of it and making corrections as I go, going from the larger to the smaller, at the end of the drawing, all of these lines are going to be there because I obviously can't erase any of them. But I don't want all these lines to be here at the end. I can't afford to draw them. So what's my method for drawing a subject when every mark I make on the paper is going to be a part of the finished artwork? I drew this for a recent video, and here is my finished drawing. And I do notice that I forgot to add the relief sculptures above these two secondary arches. So how do I draw this accurately directly in ink? Let me explain this method to you now. The first thing I do is I choose an element of the scene, of the subject, that I can draw fairly easily, fairly accurately, have the best chance of getting the proportions right. And because drawing architecture is one of my favorite subjects, it's often an element of architecture, in this case, one of these columns. And where I have many of the same to choose from, I will usually choose one that's in the center of our subject because I'm going to move out from that place, and I find it's easier to control proportions and to make adjustments if I'm moving outwards with my line work from a central position. I draw a column, and it doesn't have to be the same size, but the proportions have to be the same. This is a long, skinny column, but I need to be looking at it without the capital on top because that actually gives the feeling that it's actually a bit taller than it really is, because I've just drawn the shaft of the column here. Now, if I'm confident that I've got the proportion of the width to the height correct, then I can proceed. I can add the top of the column and I can start to expand out now. What I next do is I try and draw a section of the building rather than one element of it in the right proportions. But I've got this column as, if you like, a ruler, a measuring unit. So in this scene, I will go across, and I can go across here as well. But I will actually put in this base because it affects our perception of the arch. And I'm firstly looking at this space here. And again, it's getting those proportions correct. And then we have the rest of it. And because visually this is a strong line, I actually want to be drawing this section here first, because I can see this as a box with height and width and try and get those proportions correct, which means I need to go up from my column. And so now this line becomes this line. So now I've got two sides of my box. I've really got three sides of my box. I need to work out where this column comes. And one of the things I'm going to do, even before I do that, is I'm going to add this line here. So I can see that it's basically in the center of the column. So it's going to be there and there, say. And then there is also a line here, and I often do this as a way of bridging the gap just to help me get a sense of how much space I need here and what things have to fit within this space. So now I'm actually looking at this smaller box, smaller rectangle. And of course, I'm looking at this size at the moment. But you can see why I don't normally rush to put these sorts of lines in. I put these lines in here just now to show you my thought process, but I wouldn't actually have placed them there. I'd have gone across the way I did building as I go. And of course, every scene is different. So exactly the shapes, the lines, the alignments, the matching things up that are at the same level that we do changes with every subject. And so now we've drawn our center section of the arch freehand. And now what we have is we have this section now becomes our reference point. And I can see that the sides are narrower than the center section. So I often put dots as indicators. And now I want to draw this section with less of a gap. So from there to there is possibly from there to there. So I need to bring my column in closer. And I can work out. And then I repeat this on the other side. And then of course at the end, I need to add the additional section on the top. But this is the way I progress my drawings. And you might say, yes, but this is a very simple little box type structure, so it works well for that. But what about more complex subjects, particularly when we're not viewing them straight on? Well, how about this subject? Is this subject complex enough to put this method of drawing freehand directly in ink to the test? Does it work with such a large subject with so much detail? Because if I were going to draw with a pencil stage, then I could just look at boxes. I could draw the overall box we have here in the front, and I can add sections or cut sections out, whichever way I would like to think of it. And then I can add boxes and further shapes on top, and then I can position the architecture and line everything up. But there's going to be a lot of pencil lines at the end as I try and find the places to position things. How does this work, drawing directly in ink? Well, how do you think it worked? This was a drawing I'd looked forward to doing for a long time, but I just hadn't had time. But it still only took me 2 hours to draw, drawing this way. So how did I apply this method to this drawing? I did the same thing. I chose a column as my basic architectural element. Well, it's actually a pilaster, but I chose this one here because it was closest. And where I drew this as my basic unit of reference, in this scene, I drew this as my basic unit of reference. And then I went out to the side and drew this box all the time, working out the proportions and eyeballing my reference to try and keep these proportions as accurate as possible, keeping this width the same proportion of this greater width as it is in the reference as much as possible. Positioning this height in this total box length as much as possible. And again, I drew the column and I drew the base the column sits on. Now I had perspective angles and a lot more detail to be thinking of at the same time, but the fundamental principle was the same. And then I moved along all the way down the front of the building, always trying to be aware of, so seeing that from here to here was actually more than half the way down. And so I want from there to there to be more than half the way down. So it's looking at the proportions of what I haven't drawn in relation to what I have drawn, and often just making little marks such as dots while I checked them, cross-checked angles or cross-checked relative widths against what I'd already drawn. And then once I'd gone down the full width of the building, I then proceed up. And again, I'm looking without the dome at the proportions of this shape compared to the reference. Then once I've drawn this section, I can start to now check horizontal alignments. I can see where these elements are in relation to what I've drawn in the reference, and that helps me position them in my drawing. And again, just making little dots with the ink and just checking that those dots line up vertically and horizontally with other elements of the drawing, I can then confidently add them in. And the more I draw, the more points of reference I get to let me accurately position things. Accuracy flows on to more accuracy. It means the second half of the drawing is always a lot quicker to do than the first half of the drawing. I go much more slowly at this stage. And at the end, there is not a single line to erase. Every line that I've placed on the paper as part of this drawing process is still here. But it's a method that's ideally suited whether we're doing a relatively simple structure or a more complex structure. And if you're interested, at the end of this video, I'll include a sped up version of the complete drawing of this Berlin cathedral. So that will be at the end. And it certainly does work with very non-architectural subjects. The same principles are always at work in what I draw. So in approximately a minute and a half, here I am using this method to draw the Berlin Cathedral. Now you'll notice that corner pilaster that I've drawn and how I establish the unit of the front of that corner section as my reference point. And then I take it up to the corners and then I go across and add that next section to what I've already drawn. And now I add the next section to what I've already drawn. And all the time as I go along, I'm measuring my perspective angles. I'm checking my widths against that initial width of that first corner section. And then I jump across the arch. Now I have these trees down the front, so I don't need to continue it all the way down. And as the building moves further away, visually it compresses, it foreshortens. And so I have less and less detail I have to do. So besides narrowing the building fast enough as we move down, keeping the perspective angles correct is important. You can see that I then go up on that corner tower, and that now gives me a good reference for the details of the larger dome, which I put into place now. And then we have the lantern on top, and then we have the final tower down the corner. And again, I'm aligning this horizontally in the reference and then in my drawing as well. So I add the detail that I want to add in terms of people on the street to give a sense of scale. We have this tree on the side, and then there's the final side and that final tower. And then it's done. As I said, the system works quite well. In one of these drawings, I have a video where I talk through my thought processes and my strategizing process as I draw it. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, if you've never drawn this way before, I hope this has challenged you or encouraged you, motivated you, enthused you, inspired you to give it a go. I wasn't trying to develop my own method of drawing, but I was really motivated to be able to draw freehand directly in ink. And this is the way it worked for me as I tried to put together a method that would enable me to do it. Maybe it'll be helpful for you too. But look, whatever you draw and however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.